So you're all very welcome again, guys, and many, many thanks again to Karen for making this happen. So this morning, at some stage of the lecture this morning, I talked about, how cultures meet, and there's an entire spectrum of what happens when cultures meet, all the way from, military kind of colonization, where the one culture is totally suppressed by the other, including language, and the culture and the religion even of it. In other places, it's a kind of a seamless. In some places, it goes all the way on an extreme from being totally annihilated almost to a kind of idolatry. And by that I mean that, the phenomenon of the cargo cults. During World War II, in Polynesia, when American airmen and Japanese airmen were using the Polynesian islands as landing bases, and the local population who had never seen flying craft or people who were different from themselves were totally convinced that these were gods coming from the skies. And so when the war was over and the planes were no longer coming, they created an entire religion called the cargo cult, because the troops who visited often brought them goodies of various kinds. And so when the war was finished, the peoples of some of these islands started creating rituals, to try to get back these visitors from the skies, these gods from the skies, to bring them cargo and goodies. So they're called the cargo cults. So that's what happens when a much more technologically sophisticated culture encounters a quote-unquote primitive culture, that if there's a huge discrepancy between them, the primitive culture really believes that the visitors are God figures. And I've talked about that may actually have been the origin of religion, but that's for a separate homily or retreat even. And so the good news was that when the Celts encountered Christianity, it wasn't a colonization process and it wasn't idolatry, it was a meshing of two wisdom traditions. And I spoke this morning about my belief that it was storytelling in particular that allowed that docking to be seamless, and peaceful. So I want to go on then and talk about what are the theories about how these two great traditions actually encountered each other. What was the first, encounter, the first touch? And I'm going to mention 4 different theories, and then I'll say what I think is the most likely one. What was the first contact between Christianity and the Celtic world? And by the Celtic world here, I'm going to broaden it out a little bit. I'm not just talking about Ireland. I'm talking about the Celtic culture in general, and particularly northwestern France, southwestern England, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. So when the Celtic civilizations encountered Christianity for the first time. So there's 4 different theories as to how the very first contact may have occurred. And I'll deal with them in chronological order and then tell you what I think my own best theory is. So there's an old legend that the boy Jesus, that his uncle actually was Joseph of Arimathea. And we know that Joseph of Arimathea is a very important figure at the end of the Gospels. He's the one who goes to a Pilate and asks permission to take the bodies down from the crosses, and is given permission to do so. And wraps the body and puts it in a tomb. So we know of Joseph of Arimathea from the Gospels themselves. But there's a tradition that he was actually an uncle of Jesus, and that he was a merchant, that traded particularly in tin. And the great tin mines of Europe were in Cornwall, in England. And so there's a story that the boy Jesus in his teenage years would accompany Joseph on some of these journeys, where he was buying tin, and that he would have accompanied him to Cornwall, and in fact would have encountered the Druids of Glastonbury. So Glastonbury was a very, very sacred space for the Celtic culture. So that's one theory. And so this would mean that in some senses, Jesus had encountered the Celts before even the beginning of the Jesus ministry or the Jesus movement or Christianity. So that would be the one theory of the first contact. The second theory of first contact would be Mary of Magdala. So there's a theory, a belief system, that Mary, the companion of Jesus, was actually with child when Jesus was crucified. and that she escaped to France, and that she gave birth to a girl child, and that in fact she's the progenitor of the Merovingian bloodline, the monarchy that ruled France for about 600 years until the Carolingians took over. And so, and there's a very strong, obviously, cult of Mary of Magdala in France. And in fact, members of our community, Karen and I think Jonathan, visited there fairly recently on a tour, visiting those sacred spaces associated with Mary of Magdala. So if that's true, then Christianity itself, at the very beginning, would have encountered, the Celtic world through France. That would be a second theory. A third theory is that Christianity came from the desert fathers and the desert mothers of Egypt. And I'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later in the lecture. And so this was, these were monks and nuns who were on a kind of a pilgrimage, which was called in Latin, peregrinatio pro Dei amore, which literally means peregrination or journeying for the love of God. So that on their journeys, it was a pilgrimage, to find God and to worship God, wherever God was encountered. And that, in fact, a group of these desert fathers and desert mothers, at some stage in the 300s, left Egypt because it was getting crowded. Too many hermits occupying the deserts of Egypt. And so they decided to seek fresher pastures. And that they sailed across the Mediterranean, out through the Straits of Gibraltar, up the west coast of Europe, passing Portugal and Spain, and southwest corner of England, until they encountered the southern coast of Ireland and the western coast of Ireland, and then began to seek remote areas in Ireland. And as I mentioned this morning, Ireland was very, very heavily forested at that stage. It was only in the 1500s that the British began to cut down the forests of Ireland for shipbuilding purposes. So that these desert fathers and desert mothers, in seeking more and more remote areas, encountered Ireland and then went into various parts of the great forests of Ireland, and set up hermitages, which would have happened in the 300s. And then the fourth theory, the one most of us are aware of, was that the first contact happened through a guy called St. Patrick, who came to Ireland in 432, and between 432 and 461, was trying to Christianize Ireland. Now, there's a lot of evidence, in fact, that he wasn't the person to introduce it, and that there was a strong Celtic Christian community in Ireland before he arrived. So that would be a fourth theory. Now, based on the evidence, I am much more inclined to think that first contact happened through the Egyptian desert fathers and desert mothers. And I'll give you a few reasons why I subscribe to that theory. Firstly, the Irish Church, the Celtic Church, right up into the 1700s, was not organized according to the Roman model. The Roman model is organized around parishes and dioceses. And the parishes and dioceses were borrowed by Christianity from the Roman Empire. When Rome fell in 461 AD, and when the emperors began to move to Istanbul and call it Constantinople, the Christian church, which had been legitimized in 312 AD by Constantine, took over the reins of the Roman Empire. And they adopted all of the titles and all of the kind of the jurisdictional kinds of understandings, including the word diocese and the word parishes, and the titles like Pontifex Maximus, which was the title of the emperor and now becomes the title of the Pope. And so they adopted all the kind of nomenclature of the Roman Empire, including its jurisdictional titles. You find none of that in Ireland up to the 1700s. It was based on, definitely based on a monastic model of church. There was no such thing as parishes and no dioceses at that stage. So the religion, Christianity in Ireland, grew up organized around little chapels, around hermits. And it happened in the following fashion, that these hermits who lived in very remote locations, well, soon people became aware of that. Ordinary people became aware of it and realized that these were very holy men and holy women. And so they wanted their dead to be buried in the vicinity of these holy people. And so it's very interesting that in Irish, the word for kill can mean C-I-L-L, and you'll find it transliterated into English as K-I-L, as in Killarney or Kilkenny, or Killamode, place names. But in Gaelic, it's spelled C-I-L-L. And kill in Gaelic has two meanings. It can mean a church, or it can mean a graveyard. And so, in fact, the very first churches in Ireland, and for a long period of time, were built around graveyards, where people wanted their dead to be buried in the vicinity of holy men and holy women. So they would bury their dead in these areas. And so that's how the church, or the community, grew up around these hermits. So it seems very, very obvious to me that, that's much more likely how this system got started. In actual fact, I was ordained on the 4th of June, 1972, in a church outside Kiltegan, and the word Kiltegan is the church of, or the graveyard of, Tegan, who was an early Irish monk. But where we were ordained was a little church called Killamote. And Killamote was built in the 1840s. And there's a very interesting story as to how it came to be built. It's in County Wicklow, and the eastern part of Ireland. And in the 1840s, it's just slightly after the Act of Catholic Emancipation. It was illegal to be Catholic in Ireland during the penal days in the 1700s and 1800s. And in fact, priests were shot on sight. And so by an act of the British Parliament in 1829, called the Act of Catholic Emancipation, it was no longer illegal to be Catholic, and you were no longer liable to be shot if you were a priest. And at this stage, they started building a lot of churches in Ireland. And a community in the area of Killamote wanted to build a church. It was a strong Catholic community, but the area was owned by a Protestant landlord, and he would not allow a church to be built. And so they're trying to figure out how can they do that. They want to build a church. They have permission from the British government now. They're no longer illegals, so they can build a church. But this guy won't allow them build because it's his terrain. So they go to a very famous Irish politician called Daniel O'Connell, who was kind of almost personally responsible for the act of Catholic Emancipation. He was an Irish man, a brilliant lawyer and a brilliant orator, who was a member of the British Parliament and got the act put through Parliament. So they contacted Daniel O'Connell and asked him, how can we build a church here? This landlord won't allow us. And he said, very simple. He said, the next 3 people who die in the area, bury them secretly in the same location. And after a year, tell him you want to build a church, and he'll object, and you'll tell him it's established in Irish law that if a place becomes the burial site for 3 or more people, it's a church, it's a kill, and therefore you have permission to build. And that's precisely what they did. And the church was built in the 1845 as a result. The landlord tried to stop it, and Daniel O'Connell represented the law and showed him that he couldn't stop it. And the church was built in 1845, and that's where I was ordained in June of 1972. And so for me, it's a proof that this really was the first contact between Christianity and the Celts. Didn't happen with Patrick. Patrick came at least 100 years after it had reached Ireland, and maybe much longer than that after it had reached perhaps Cornwall or France. And so the pièce de résistance was in the year 644 AD, Rome sent a delegation to and held a big conference that was held actually in Scotland in 664 AD, called the Council of Whitby. Whitby was the place where it happened. And it was an effort to lick the Celts into shape. Rome was really concerned that the Celtic Church was doing its own thing and was not in a kind of alignment with Rome. And particularly around the timing of Easter. The Celtic Church was following the Johannine calendar. When you read John's Gospel, there's a very, very different notion of when Christ died from what's called the Petrine notion. So Rome was following one kind of a calendar for Easter, and the Celts were following a different calendar for Easter, based on John's Gospel. And so Rome was this is now 644 AD, and Rome is still trying to lick them into some kind of Roman shape. and the council finally kowtowed, and the Celts of Scotland and Wales and France agreed, but the Celts of Ireland did not agree. And for another 1,000 years, the Celtic Church in Ireland continued to operate according to the Johannine calendar, or the Celtic calendar. And so right down into almost modern times, it's very, very obvious that the Irish Celtic Church was based on an Egyptian model rather than a Roman model. So that's the kind of what I wanted to say about how the Christianity came to the Celts. So I want to look then at what I call how the Celts saved Europe. And I'm going to make the claim that this happened on at least two famous occasions. When Rome fell and what was called the Pax Romana, that the Romans were so militarily powerful that they were actually able to lick the known world into some semblance of peace and build all these great roadways. So there was peace only because Roman occupation dominated the entire thing. But when Rome fell, about 461 AD, the Vandals invaded from Germany particularly and sacked Rome. And the Roman Empire crumbled. And at this stage, Europe slips into the Dark Ages, and even literacy almost disappears. And religion, the Christian religion particularly, really takes on a dark and sinister kind of a character. And it's at this stage that Irish monks step in and literally save the literacy of Europe and save, Christianity from becoming a completely shadow of its former self. So that's one occasion on which the Celtic Church stepped in and saved the bacon of Christianity. A little bit later on, in 1517, after Luther had nailed his 95 theses on the cathedral door in Wittenberg, I believe, and there's this break, and rightly so, because of the skullduggery of the Roman Church at that stage was unbelievable. Not just indulgences, but all kinds of shenanigans. Popes murdering each other in order to succeed to the throne of Peter. One famous occasion, the Borgias had taken over the Roman Catholic Church, so different great Roman families took over the church and were popes and prelates of various kinds. I had a professor of church history in the seminary, a guy called Colm Cook, brilliant guy, educated in Oxford, PhD from Oxford, but he affected an upper class English accent, even though he was from County Galway, where my mother was from. And it is very, very upper class English to affect a stutter. And so Colm had affected a stutter. And I remember in one class particularly on the papacy in the 1500s, and he's talking about a pope called Alexander VI. And he says, Alexander the VI made many mistakes, one of whom was to succeed him to the papacy. So that's what it was like. Literally popes, having kids who became popes when they were dead, or killing each other. And so that was the church that Luther encountered. And so something had to be done. Now, the problem was that Luther threw the baby out with the bathwater. And so the Protestant Reformation, for all its good intentions and for all it did accomplish, it had a huge puritanical shadow side. And Calvin and company sucked all the joy and all the spontaneity out of spirituality. And again, it was Celtic spirituality that came to the rescue. And in particular, I believe it rescued three vital elements of really spiritual and mystical Christianity. It rescued Mariology, devotion to Mary. It rescued monasticism, and it rescued mysticism. And I want to talk now about these three pieces in a bit more detail. When the Celts were first introduced to Mary, I can just imagine this, we know Mary. We know Mary really, really well, because they accepted Mary as the goddess figure. She was the quintessential mother figure of the divine. She was the feminine face of the divine. They had zero problem accepting Mary. She was the archetype par excellence of Mother Nature. And so the fact that she had a child called Jesus, that was great. No problem whatsoever. So there was a zero problem about, encountering Mary and adopting a devotion to Mary. In fact, one of the great Irish abbesses, after whom a great Irish church is called, the Church of Kildare, and again, there you get the word kill, Kildara, which literally means the Church of the Oak Tree. And the great leader of that church was a woman called St. Bridget. And Bridget is often called Muire na Nghail. Now, I told you yesterday that, or was it today? I forget. That the word Mary is translated into Gaelic as Moira, M-A-I-R-E, with an accent over the A. So when any woman is called Mary, when her name is spoken in Gaelic, she's called Moira. But Mary, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is the only woman, when her name is spoken of in Gaelic, she's not called Moira, she's called Muire, M-U-I-R-E. So there's only one exception to that rule, and that's St. Bridget. Bridget is known as Muire na Nghail, Mary of the Irish, or the Gaels. And so she was this extraordinary abbess who was the leader of a huge monastery in Kildare, a monastery that had both men and women as monks and nuns in it. So they had zero problem accepting Mary, no issue whatsoever. She was the ultimate quintessential feminine face of God for them. Now, at this stage, into the Dark Ages, even before puritanical Protestantism, you had Jesus being reduced to a judge, an angry, tyrannical judge. So much so that, the Crusaders felt, that they were accomplishing the work of Jesus by marching across Europe, beginning in 1099 AD, with the cross of Christ on the front of their tunic as they're going to battle, and the cross of child on the back of their tunics when they're coming back from the slaughter. And these were the people who decimated the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Jews of Jerusalem and the Saracens, the Muslims that they encountered. And Jesus had been reduced to this tyrant who then justified the Inquisition, the literal dismembering of people, pulling them asunder on the rack and burning them at the stake, all in the name of this Jesus figure, who had now become this absolute tyrant. And of course, what are people going to do? They're going to look for the feminine face of God. And at this stage, in Europe in the 1200s, you get the first great cathedrals which are being built, dedicated to Mary, like Notre Dame, our mother. And they're always built on sacred sites associated with the goddesses of Europe, with the Celtic goddesses of Europe. And so the rosary will be invented at this stage. So they're praying to Mary at this stage. They know that they're afraid of the Father. He's a distant, demanding deity. And they're scared of Jesus because he's a tyrant who kills and tortures. And so they turn to the face of Mary. And here is where, again, the Celts come to the fore. The Celtic notion of the feminine face of God. So you have Mary smuggling people into heaven behind the back of Jesus and the Father. And I heard these stories from my great-grandmother, whom I called Muddy. She loved Jesus, and she'd occasionally acknowledge the presence of the Father, and had a kind of a working knowledge of the Holy Spirit, but they were as nothing compared to Mary. I would hear my great-grandmother, and I've told you many stories about her, talking aloud to Mary. And I was privileged to these conversations because, she was in my life until I was almost 10 years of age. And she spoke to Mary aloud, in her old age, as one woman would speak to another woman. And so that's how alive Mary was to Celtic Christianity, even in my childhood in the 1940s. And so puritanical Protestantism, had killed that in the 1500s, regarding Mariology as an idolatry. Putting Mary on a divine level was the equivalent, of idolatry as far as puritanical Protestantism was concerned. And so Mary got dumped with the bathwater of the Lutheran Reformation. The second thing that got dumped at that stage was monasticism. And I want to give just a kind of a brief look at, the history of monasticism, Christian monasticism. I mean, you have this notion of monasticism going way back in the Hindu scriptures, but in Christianity, it begins with Saint Anthony of Egypt, who was born in 251 AD. You know, he found that he was a hermit who lived in the desert. His intention was just to go and be alone and to kind of find God in solitude. But very soon the idea caught fire. And so the deserts of Egypt got crowded with desert fathers and desert mothers who wanted to be alone. And it was harder and harder to be alone in the deserts of Egypt because everybody wanted to be in on the act. And so that was the first phase of kind of Christian monasticism, the individual hermits trying to live alone. And there's some really funny stories being told about that. I remember hearing one as a child about two hermits who lived, 9 or 10 miles away from each other, who had a vow of silence, and they were allowed to speak only once every 7 years. And one guy comes out of his cave, and he sees the other guy 7 miles around the world, and he says, "Nice day today," and goes back into his cave. 7 years later, the other guy comes out and he says, "Not as nice as yesterday, though," and goes back into his cave. 7 years later, the third guy comes out, he says, "If you guys don't stop arguing, I'm going to leave here." So that was how crowded it was getting at the time. So there's a second movement to Christian monasticism. And it begins with Saint Petronius, who was born in 292 AD. And he had a different version where they lived as hermits Monday through Friday. They went off into the desert and they lived to kind of try to find isolated spots, and they lived as hermits Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. But then on Saturday and Sunday, they came together for religious ceremonies to celebrate Eucharist together. So it was a modified version of Anthony. So they're hermits, 5 days out of 7, and they're form a community then on the weekend for Eucharist. There's a third phase that begins with Saint Benedict, who was born in 480 AD. And these are full-time communities of monks and subsequently of nuns. So they're no longer living as hermits, either full-time or even part-time. They're now living in community. But they're living silent lives. There is no permission to speak. The only time they used their voices was for the liturgy of the word, when they came together, for matins or lauds or compline or whatever, several times during the day to sing, praise to God. That was the only time they were allowed to speak. And so their silent lives revolved around the axes of prayer and study and manual labor. They were the three great facets of the monk's life: prayer, study, and manual labor. And they were totally self-sufficient communities. They built their own monasteries, they built their own furniture, they made their own clothes, they grew their own food, and they tended to their own medical needs. And so, they were totally self-sufficient as communities. Now, the Celtic Church, when the Celtic wisdom encountered monasticism, they took to it like ducks to water. They really, really loved it. And so you find all these three strains of monasticism: individual hermits, semi-hermetical life, and then community monks and nuns. You find all these three in Celtic Christianity. So the Celts loved nothing better than to confront death and to laugh at it. And that found its way in Ireland right down into my childhood at the infamous Irish wakes, where they would laugh at death to the extent that the dead body would be waked in the home for 3 days and 3 nights and then taken and buried. And there'd be big partying and dancing and drinking and smoking pipes, during which they would take the corpse off the table and dance with it. So there was the reason it was called a living room. There was a living room where people lived, and then there was a dead room where the body was waked. And they would take the corpse and then they would dance with the corpse. And at some stage, the Catholic Church says, enough of that. And they banned Irish wakes around the time I was a child. But they still went on. And so the Irish, laughed in the face of death. Not that they despised it, but they realized it's a phase of life. So they didn't believe in life after that. They believed that there was only life, and that death was just a phase of casting off this mortal coil. Now, from the 6th to the 13th centuries, a group of monks, 12 at a time, lived on a little island off the southwest coast of Ireland called Skellig. And I want to show you a picture of what that looks like. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that there? Can you see this? It's literally like a broken tooth sticking up in the Atlantic, about 10 miles off the southwest coast of Ireland. And it's called Skellig. Skellig means literally just this crop of rock. Skellig Michael is called there. That's the English version. In Gaelic, it's called Skellig Vihil, the rock of Michael. And from the 6th to the 13th century, there was a group of monks who lived in really, really difficult circumstances. And they lived on seagulls' eggs and on fish and on rainwater. But in the 13th century, the climate of Europe changed radically. And it became such storms and such rain that the monks left the island. And nobody lived on the island from the 13th century until 1970s. And the first person to go back and live on the island on Skellig Vihil for 3 months was my father, Paddy O'Leary, who was an archaeologist. And early in the 1970s, he spent 3 months on his own, living on the Skelligs and doing the first archaeological surveys and drawings of it. And he lived there for 3 months, and once a month, a boat would come from the mainland and deliver him supplies, you know. And he was the first person to do the archaeological drawings of the Skellig. And in the 1980s, it came to the attention of the archaeology department in UC Berkeley in California, and a professor called Walter Horn. And he went and using small planes, they mapped the entire island. And together with, you know, archaeologists from Ireland, and including my father, and his name is on it, they produced this book that I've just showed you, Skellig Michael, the Forgotten Hermitage of Skellig Michael or Skellig Vihil. You can see his name down here, Paddy O'Leary. And there's one great photograph of him hanging over a cliff, if I can find it here. And I don't know if you can see it or not. Can you see a guy up there hanging over the cliff? And he's got a rope attached to him so he doesn't fall off. And he's surveying, you know, a part of the terrain. That's my father, Paddy O'Leary, right there. So they produced this beautiful book. And what they discovered was that at the very, very top of this Skellig, right up there, right on the pinnacle, there was a hermitage. So the 12 monks lived down here in this area, and they had a little garden. They grew some stuff, and they collected seagulls' eggs and fished. But right on the very top, there was a hermitage. And that's why the book is called The Forgotten Hermitage of Skellig Vihil. They discovered this hermitage, you know, and some extraordinary monk lived on the top of that. I don't know if they took turns living there. You can imagine what the wind and the rain looked like, you know, 715 feet in the air out in the middle of the Atlantic. So that's what monasticism meant to the Celts. So there were fearless characters who wanted more and more to be more and more isolated and more in the hand of God, depending literally on the hand of God. So that was part of what got dumped during the Protestant Reformation in an effort to kind of cleanse clericalism from the church. They dumped monasticism as well. Now it survived even in parts of Protestantism. People like Jacob Boehm and people like that, it did survive. But by and large, for the populace in general, it was thrown out. Now the third great thing that got dumped with the Reformation is mysticism. And I believe actually that wrestling with God has gone through 5 great stages in the human trajectory. Since the advent of Homo sapiens sapiens about 70,000 years ago, which was when we developed language skills, and for the first time with the ability to manipulate symbols intracranially, to use symbols, and therefore to be able to imagine in here stuff which wasn't present out there. And so the first use to which they put language, I believe, was storytelling. And the first kinds of storytellers, the first kinds of stories they told to each other were stories about who made all of this, what's up there, You know, what happens when we die? The great existential and cosmological questions. They were the first kinds of stories that we told ourselves. So I believe that there were 5 stages then that we moved through in that process. And the first one, I call it the era of the theologians. It's when we began to speak about God, or more precisely at that stage, about the gods and the goddesses. So it was talking about the gods and the goddesses. That's the first stage in the mystical journey, the theologians, the theological stage. Sometime later comes what I call the priestly stage. You're not just talking about the gods now, you're attempting to speak to the gods, not about them, but to them. And so now there'll be prayers offered and sacrifices done and rituals engaged in. So this will be the second phase of the movement towards God. Not speaking about God, speaking to God. The third stage will be what I call the era of the prophets. It is people who are tasked with speaking on behalf of God. And so this is a kind of a new era in the journey, that there are some people who seem to be especially close or are designated in some fashion to be God's mouthpiece and to speak to people on God's behalf. And you find this in all traditions. The fourth stage comes much later, and I call it the stage of the mystic. And it's those who speak as God. Not about God, and not to God, and not on behalf of God, but as God. Because there are people who come to the realization that there only is God. Nothing exists except God. And everything that exists is a manifestation of divinity. And therefore every human being, you know, is God, the phrase I've used, God in drag, in some senses. So that's what the mystic knows. So when the mystic chooses to speak, she's speaking as God. She's not going to waste her time talking theological terminology. You know, she's going to speak at all. She's going to speak as God. She's going to represent her own inner divinity and engage with the inner divinity of everybody else. And Hinduism will call that namaste. The divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. But there's one place I believe in even beyond that. And they're the non-dual mystics. And they're the mystics who don't even speak as God. They choose not to speak at all, because they realize that even language is a very leaky vessel, and there is no way in which you can articulate the ineffability of the transcendence of source by using the kind of the immanence of language. And so you can experience God, the transcendence of God. You can have a deep mystical union, but as soon as you attempt to articulate it, even to try to represent it as the divine within you, communicating with the divine within the other, even in that kind of conversation, something gets lost. And so this is a level of mysticism, you know, which is beyond communication, and which you can recognize in nature and elsewhere, but you certainly will never see in dogma or creedal formulations. And so it's interesting to me that the Celtic wisdom that Christianity encountered, you know, had reached most of those stages. Certainly they'd gone through the theological stage, the priestly stage, the prophetic, even the mystic, you know, and they're reaching towards the non-dual mystic. Maybe this perhaps is what the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers added to the equation. Maybe this was the great benefit to the Celtic wisdom. It was the fifth stage of mysticism, the mysticism beyond even articulation, beyond the spoken word. So the Celts returned the favor by bringing that back to Europe. And in some places it wasn't well received. And so, for instance, there's a famous character, Celt, and a great Irish theologian called Pelagius, who was absolutely fluent in Greek and Latin, as well as Gaelic, obviously, who first went to Rome, you know, and did his shtick in Rome, and didn't receive a great welcome there. And so went to Carthage and encountered our good friend Augustine, and ran out of favor with Augustine, and went to Jerusalem, you know, and encountered Saint Jerome, who translated the Hebrew scriptures from Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin, and the Christian scriptures from Greek into Latin. So Pelagius was a good friend of his for a time until Jerome got fed up with him. And finally, he's declared a heretic. And Saint Cyril, a great hermit, the Bishop of Alexandria, befriended Pelagius and invited him to go to Egypt. So he died in Egypt. But he was actually declared officially a heretic by the Council of Ephesus in 431. And he was a heretic mainly because of the theology of free will. Unlike Augustine, he totally disagreed. He felt that we were free to experience God, and that we had the ability to access the God within. We didn't need dogma, and we didn't even need ritual, and we certainly didn't even need a religious organization to help us to find God. So this was just too much for Augustine and Jerome and two popes. I think it was Innocent I and Zosimus, who both declared Pelagius a heretic. And so finally, he's declared a total heretic. But he believed totally in the inner divinity of every one of us. And so it's interesting to me that Augustine created a document of 9 points where he showed that Pelagius was in error and heretical. And one of the claims was Pelagius refused to agree. It was point number 9 in Augustine's outline of 9 things, 9 heresies of Pelagius. And number 9 was that Pelagius refused to believe that if a child died without being baptized, it was denied heaven and denied eternal life. Pelagius wouldn't sign off on that. And Augustine felt, see, that's evidence that he's an actual heretic. Because we all know, because of original sin, that if a child dies before it's baptized, it cannot ever see God, and it cannot go to heaven, and it cannot have eternal being, eternal life. And Pelagius disagreed violently with this, and that's evidence, obviously, that he was a heretic, not to be trusted. So my kind of conclusion, in a sense, is this then. I call it the Celtic Diaspora. So here we are in 2020 in America, or Kenya, or Germany, wherever you find yourself right now. But speaking as a Celt in diaspora, who grew up in Ireland until I was 26, spent the next 14 years in East Africa, a year in England, and then now 33 years in the United States. And knowing the history of my people, so we had the Celts who invaded 600 BCE, and then we had Christianity coming, I believe, about the 300s. We had the Vikings desecrating, the monasteries beginning in 795 AD. We had the Normans coming to Ireland, conquering Ireland beginning in 1169 AD, and trying desperately to bring Roman Catholicism with them and suppress Celtic Christianity, which they did not succeed in for several hundred years more. Then we had the English, after the Normans had become the English, and now those who were ruling Ireland are kind of English kings. And then the introduction of what are called the Penal Laws in the 1600s and 1700s, when it was illegal to be a Catholic, and when it was a crime punishable by death to be a Catholic priest. And so the Catholic priests now are killed on sight, and they're saying Mass in woods, what was left of the forests, and at Mass rocks. And then the devastating famine of 1845 to 1847, when the population of Ireland was reduced over a 10-year period from 8 million people down to 4 million people through death and through famine. But a little bit like what Tibetan Buddhism did in 1959, when the Chinese conquered Tibet and the Dalai Lama's exiled. And a little bit of what happened in our country and our continent, North and South America, beginning in 1492, with the desecration of Native American Indian traditions and the supplanting of it with Roman Catholicism and Christianity in various kinds. And our realization eventually that we have to recover that wisdom and recover and save the wisdom of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. And so in the 1840s and 1850s and right up to recent times, you had the gaunt, starving, hounded Irish I believe, they carried a virus across the ocean to America, to England, to Australia, to Canada. They carried a virus with them. Hidden in the cells of their Roman Catholicism lay the mitochondria of their ancient Celtic spirituality. And it's been part of my mission in Palo Alto to try to fan the embers of that into flame. I think that these people carried within them the antidote to the soulless, materialistic science that desecrates nature as a mere resource, and that they carried, in their hearts, the antidote to a soulless, to a kind of a heartless, fundamentalist religion that reduces awe at the motherhood of God down to fear at the fatherhood of a wrathful divinity. And I certainly know that in my childhood, I was so lucky to have encountered a great-grandmother who was a mystic in the very best sense of mysticism, who spoke on a daily basis aloud. She didn't quite get to the non-dual, non-speaking part. It was important for her to speak to Mary, and she did on a regular basis. And on the other side of my family, my maternal grandfather, Daddy Jim, who was a bard and a druid, really, without ever being given those titles, or ever assuming any one of those titles. And learning from them, that real spirituality is the admixture, the cross-fertilization of the great Celtic wisdom and the great Jesus story. And I realized as a Celt, and this is where I came up with this statement of mine, the realization that life is a dream that the soul is having, and that the soul is a dream that the spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that source is having. And that ultimately, literally every single one of us is just a manifestation of source. And I want to end by giving an extended answer to a question that Thomas asked this morning, a very interesting question where he said the Catholicism that he encountered as a young man growing up in the United States 70 or 80 years ago was very different from the Celtic Christianity that I spoke of in the first lecture this morning, and indeed it was. And I agree that even the Roman Catholicism that I grew up with in the 1940s in Ireland, was a pale shadow of the Celtic Christianity of which I spoke in the first lecture today. For these reasons, when Celtic Christianity had actually survived all the way down to the Penal Laws in the 1700s, until finally it was driven completely underground, and priests were hounded and killed on sight. And so now priests are being educated on the continent of Europe in great Irish colleges in Louvain, in Spain, in Belgium. But in the late 1700s, early 1800s, there was a heresy swept through Roman Catholicism, courtesy of a Dutch bishop called Jansen. And it's called Jansenism. And it introduced into Roman Catholicism a puritanical, almost Protestant version of Catholicism, one which was based on the exclusion of nature, the domination of nature, on the vilification of sexuality and the suppression of the feminine. And so after the Act of Catholic Emancipation in 1829, when it was no longer illegal to be a Catholic, and it was okay for priests, to come back and be educated in Ireland, they started building, the first great seminary was built in 1845 in a place called Maynooth. But the priests who were coming back from Europe at this stage have been contaminated very seriously by Jansenism. And so their idea of nature and their idea of sexuality and their idea of the feminine has been totally bastardized. And so the Christianity, the Catholicism that I was raised on, officially by the church, although I was raised on a totally different version by my great-grandmother and by my grandfather, and the stories they told me were stories that went way, way, way back literally almost 2,000 years. So I was getting one version of Catholicism in church and getting a totally different version in my home. But the version I was getting from the church was the version that Catholic missionaries subsequently took to the United States and to Australia and to England and to Canada when they became missionaries to the English-speaking world. Unfortunately, they brought this totally bastardized version of Irish Catholicism with them. And so, in answer to your question, Tom, that is the reason why you were introduced to a Catholicism, which did not respect nature and probably vilified sexuality and suppressed the feminine. Thanks, guys. Okay, that's a great question. And I want to thank you for what you are doing in your community. It's interesting that, there's a great statement that there's only one kind of real healer. That's a wounded healer. That it's our woundedness that either destroys us or moves us into compassion. And when you look at particularly the shamanistic traditions, you look, for instance, even in North America, in our own kind of area here, in the United States and Canada, that very, very often the shaman was somebody who was either crippled in some fashion, physically as a child, or emotionally as a child, or even sometimes even appeared to have had a mental breakdown. But what was happening, it was a spiritual emergence rather than a mental emergency. But previous cultures handled it very, very differently. They saw those people as somehow being in touch with God very differently. We have just given diagnostic codes to these people. There's a term in Ireland, in Irish, for somebody who would be regarded as crazy or mad or schizophrenic. The phrase we use in Irish is Dinna le dia, which literally means a person with God, so that they're accessing different dimensions. The difficulty becomes that for some of them, they're not bilingual. They're not able to translate the transdimensional experiences into the language of physicality and incarnation. And so there's a saying that says the difference between a mystic and a schizophrenic is simply that the schizophrenic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims, because the schizophrenic somehow can't make the connection between the two worlds and know which world they're in and articulate their message in a particular fashion. Now, the Native American Indians knew that these were people with God, that the shaman who had some kind of a childhood disability, whether it was mental, emotional, or physical, that was a preparation for a shamanistic mission. And that therefore, they were bringing a different kind of wisdom into them. But we live in times when an alternate viewpoint, is deplatformed. And so it becomes very, very difficult for us to introduce spiritual concepts or different perspectives into life. And so I really appreciate what you're doing. And the very fact of your woundedness may in fact be your ordination. Whether or not you went through a ritual, where somebody put oil in your forehead and designated or commissioned you, I don't know your story, but I can tell you that your very woundedness was your ordination. And that empowers you to be a missionary to your people. And sometimes you're going to just have to smuggle donkeys. Sometimes you're going to have to sow the seeds. You may not even reap the harvest. Maybe somebody else who reaps the harvest. But as long as the seeds are sown, you've done your job. I'll actually be talking about that tomorrow. The whole theme for tomorrow is spirituality beyond gender. And you're raising a very important issue. And it's an issue that has to be transcended. We can't get stuck in the anger. And that's going to be a huge part of the message tomorrow. I think that's beautiful. I would add to that, forgiveness is necessary only because we are bite-sized bits of divinity. And there are very few, self-realized avatars on the planet, I think. And so the rest of us have to try to work with, the little bite-sized bits of divinity I have access to because of my own life. And that means that as long as I keep indulging angry thoughts or anxious thoughts or unforgiving thoughts, I'm holding up the process. So God has no problem whatsoever. God is adopting all perspectives. But each of us is responsible for that little splinter of consciousness that we carry within us, that little fractal of divinity that we hold within us. And we're responsible for nurturing and birthing that piece. And that's where the anger resides, and that's where the unforgiveness has a hold. Otherwise, the planet would be Christ conscious as it is, and it's not, because there are literally billions of us hanging on to these tiny little splinters of unforgiveness from our personal journey, our national journey, or our religious journey. And that's what we have to let go of if we're going to be on the forefront of this renewal and these rebirthing. We have to quench all of that kind of darkness in ourselves. Well, I'm sure there are many out there that I don't know of. There's a few names I've known of. An Irish priest, also from Cork, whom I've never met, called Diarmid O'Marachu. And I'm sure you all knew John Donahoe, who was a Catholic priest. He died very young, unfortunately, died in his 50s. John was a true Celtic mystic. And he actually, he left the church. He got either kicked out or left. But if you read any of John's work, his poetry or his Anamachara, there was a true Celtic mystic, masquerading as a Catholic priest for a period of time. So I'm sure there are other people, and they're not necessarily priests. A lot of, I think very, very often it's the nuns, the sisters, who have been at the forefront of so many different, evolutionary shifts in Christianity and in Roman Catholicism. They're the ones, it seems to me, who are really embracing the change much more than the priests are. They're the ones at the forefront of this. And so they're the people you can kind of investigate, I tell you, when I remember having my first fight with God, I was age 4, and I was raised by my grandparents for the first 6 years of my life. I was raised, because my grandmother and my mother were both pregnant at the same time. That's strange to begin with, and I was born actually 3 months before my youngest uncle, Uncle Noel, and we're still really, really close. And so my grandmother wanted me to live with them because, I was the firstborn of my mother, and she didn't know diddly squat about raising a baby. So she said, I've raised 6 of them already. I have another one coming. I look after him. And either she grabbed me or she persuaded me. I have no idea what happened. But in any case, I'm raised by my grandmother, and my great-grandmother is present there. And my Uncle Noel, who's 3 months younger than me. I'm born in October of 1946, and he's born on December 1946. But I remember we're a very, very poor family. And we're living in a project called Grana Broher, and narrow little streets. And my best buddy lived right across the street. His name was Pat Gunning. And Pat Gunning's father was an engineer. And for me, that was the equivalent of being like a billionaire at that stage. Now, I don't know how much money they had, but the fact that his father was working full-time, getting a decent salary, and was an engineer made him a kind of a rich guy, in my opinion. But we were great buddies. But I remember one Christmas in Ireland, the way you wrote to Santa Claus was you take a page out of a copybook, and you would say, "Dear Santa, my name is Sean O'Leary. I live in number 34 St. Rita's Avenue, and I want a gun and holster for Christmas." And then I made very sure he didn't get the wrong chimney, because there's 2 chimney stacks. And so there's the one on the left goes to our house, and the one on the right goes to the house next door. So I'm telling you, make sure you get it down and come down the right chimney. I'm getting a lot of feedback now. Is that mine?
Just for a second. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, you're good. Okay.
And so then you put the letter up the chimney, because there's always a turf fire, and the hot air brings the letter up the chimney. And then you run outside and you watch the piece of paper floating off up to the North Pole. And so I asked him for a gun and holster. And a week later, it's Christmas morning, I run downstairs, there's a little Christmas tree, and there's a creche there with Mary and Jesus, the baby Jesus, and Joseph and the donkey and the shepherds and stuff. and there's a little gun and holster, and I can't believe my luck. And I strap it on, and it's a little cloth belt, and there's a little gun in it, and I run outside to play. And Pat Gunning comes out of his house at the very same time, and he's wearing this big leather belt and this huge big, looked like a real gun. And we're going, bang, 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 I got you. No, I got you first, I got you. And then I realize he's got this gun with a mother of pearl handle, real, silver gun. And I got this little dinky little plastic thing in a cloth holster. And I'm devastated. And I go back in home crying. And I take the gun holster and I fire at the creche. And I knock over the baby Jesus and Joseph and a bunch of the sheep. And I'm really upset. And my grandmother says to me, what ails you? Why are you crying? Why are you angry? And I said more or less, I couldn't obviously articulate as well, but I said more or less, I know that we're poor and that we can't afford stuff during the year. And that Pat Gunning is rich and he can have good stuff. But at Christmas time, I wrote to Santa Claus for a gun and holster, and you should see what he gave me, and you should see what he gave Pat Gunning. I can't believe that Santa Claus, who's God's right-hand man, discriminates against the poor. And so if you want to say, when did I get weird? I got weird probably around then. That's beautiful. So in answer to your first part of your question or comment today, I'm going to be dealing absolutely tomorrow with this entire issue, with the what I call spirituality beyond gender. And I'm going to be speaking very specifically about, what Jesus' relationship with his mother and with the Magdalene was. And I'm going to be talking specifically about the priesthood of women, very specifically tomorrow. So I'll go into much more detail right now, but to agree with you completely that he had a totally different relationship, with women that was the norm for his time. And just to kind of, again, synopsize my own belief system, I really believe that in the notion of a soul pod, that souls come in together in groups with a shared mission. And I think, there are various levels of the soul pod. So you may have a soul mate, and then there's a wider group, maybe 5 or 6 very, very close confidants. And then maybe there's a family you were born into. And then there's the village of which you are a part. And then maybe the culture, and then maybe the nation, and then all human beings, and then all sentient beings. So it ripples out. But at the core of this Jesus movement, I really believe there was a triad. And I may have mentioned this yesterday, or at this stage I'm losing track of time. Normally in the Gospels, if I were to tell you the phrase, there were 3 who always walked with Jesus. And if you're a typical Christian, I said to you, there were 3, according to the Gospels, there were 3 who always walked with Jesus. Who were those 3? Very likely you'd say, oh, that was Peter, James, and John. They seem to be the inner sanctum. They were the guys he took up to the top of the mountain on Tabor for the transfiguration. But the Gospel of Philip, the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, says there were 3 who always walked with the Lord. And all 3 were called Mary. There was Mary, his mother, there was Mary, his sister, and there was Mary, his companion. And so it feels to me like there was a soul pod. And 3 of the 4 members of the soul pod. I think sometimes I extend it to 5 members. I think John, the beloved, may have been one of the groups. So let's say 5. So you had his mother, his sister, his companion, and John, the beloved disciple. For me, they represent a soul pod whose commission was to set the planet aflame with a new ethos, a Christ consciousness, a total or a Christa consciousness, to use the feminine aspect of it. And that this was their mission. And the mission wasn't just coterminous with their physical lifespan. It didn't end when Jesus was crucified, or where Mary of Magdala died in France, or Mary, the mother of Jesus, died in Ephesus. Their mission didn't end at that stage. A true avatar's mission doesn't end with the shelf life of a particular space suit. It continues on. And so that their mission and their commissioning is to keep leavening, spirituality and the world right now. So you find yourself in a position with John and with Wavin in a community, and in some senses, you're sowing seeds. And I'm sure it must be difficult for you. Most religious communities are fairly orthodox, and they resent any movement out of the box. And so somehow through your music perhaps, and much more importantly, through your mindset and through your soul set, you are impregnating that community with your soul's energy at a level at which they're not grokking it intellectually. They're not even aware of it intellectually. If they were, they might get rid of you. So you're doing it sotto voce, and that's how you maybe have to do it for a period of time until the energy of the group begins to shift and they begin to kind of dream a better vision than mere orthodoxy. And sometimes that takes time for communities. And sometimes it's important to ask the question, is this the best use of my time? Is this the most, is this the best contribution I can make to the birthing of Christ consciousness by being a member of a particular community or a particular ministry? Is there a better way to do it sometimes? And sometimes we have to get out of the box or out of the particular community. And I've had to do that, as a Catholic priest with the Roman Catholic Church by, helping to found Companions on the Journey 22 years ago, and then being officially, cut off by Rome 10 years ago, in a 2-page Latin document that I received. So sometimes you choose to make the break, and sometimes the break chooses to make you quit. So in some sense, it doesn't matter. As long as you're doing what your soul is telling you to do, you have to decide what the right context and right community for you is.